Hi everyone, my name is Sanem Bonarens. I'm one of the co-founders of OnTracx, and in this video I will guide you through the entire Pro platform. If, however, there would be additional questions that go beyond this video, I'm happy to guide you to our website, more specifically to our support page for more information. Enjoy the video. Hi everybody. In this video, I will show you how to use the OnTracx Pro platform. First, you will need to go through the website pro.ontrax.com. By filling in your email address as well as the password that you received, you will be able to log in into the platform. Once you logged in into the platform, you will be redirected to this main screen. And here you can get an overview of all your athletes. You can choose to organize them whether they are in rehab or out of rehab and whether they are on tracks or off tracks. The on-tracx or off-tracx classification is also a classification that you can see over here, and it shows you in which athletes rehabilitation is going fine or in which athletes an intervention is needed. You can choose to organize your athletes in a detailed list or via a tile function, as you can see over here. You can always return to the main screen by using this button, and here we will redirect you to the lab setting, to the settings menu, and you can also log out of the platform. If you want to add an athlete to the main screen, you can click on this button. You will be redirected to this screen in which we will ask you to enter the email address of your athlete. By doing so, we will ask you some personal information, physical information, and injury information, which allows us to create a tolerance profile of that athlete. If, however, the athlete already has downloaded the application and has set up an account, this information will not need to be filled in again, and all the details will be transferred automatically. Once the athlete was added to the platform, he will be visible in this list. Let's say, for example, James Parker was added. By clicking on James Parker, the following screen will appear, where you immediately will see whether James Parker has a high, a medium, or a low load tolerance profile. A high load tolerance profile means that in this case, James Parker is quite acquainted to experiencing the load during running and therefore has less risk of an overuse injury, whether a low load tolerance profile is related to a higher risk of overuse injury. You can click here on the Show Details button to see why a high tolerance profile was attributed to James Parker. And here we take into account the age of the patient, the BMI of the patient, the running experience, the experience in other impact sports such as football, basketball, and volleyball, injury proneness of the athlete, and the current pain. Once a tolerance profile has been attributed to the athlete, there is also an advised load progression connected to it. In this case, it is 120%, meaning that James Parker can increase his load week after week with 20% compared to the previous weeks. A low load tolerance profile will here have a lower advised load progression because he or she has a higher risk for sustaining an overuse injury. Every time the athlete goes for a run, and this can be within the clinical setting or outside of the clinical setting, the load of that running session will be monitored and transferred to the OnTracx Pro platform. By scrolling down, you will see the following figure with on the horizontal axis the time in weeks, for example, week 13, 14, 15, and so on, and on the vertical axis, the total load in G-forces. Every bar represents one running session, with the larger bars representing more load. So the higher or the larger a bar is, the higher the load was during a certain running session. As such, you can objectively see how the load increases over time and whether or not there is overloading of the body. The green zone, which is depicted over here, represents the advised load progression. If the athlete falls within or beneath the green zone, the safe zone, there is less risk for sustaining an overuse injury. For example, the bars here in pink and here in pink show that the athletes went above the advised load progression and thereby overloaded the body. Once or twice is of course not a problem, but systematically overloading the body week after week is related with a higher risk of overuse injuries. After every running session, the athlete also gives a pain score related to that running session, which can also be followed up in this graph. For example, in this athlete, the pain reduces slightly week after week after week. As mentioned before, we will categorize athletes as OnTracx or OffTracx. OnTracx means that rehabilitation is going well, while OffTracx means that an intervention is needed. And this classification is mainly based on the pain level of that athlete and the load progression of the athlete. If the pain level is too high or is increasing, or if the load progression of that week is too high or also increasing, the athlete will be categorized as OffTracx. So it's necessary there to check whether or not an intervention is needed. Also, by hovering over the figure over here, you can see in a very time-efficient way detailed information about the lost running sessions. If you want to deep dive into a certain session, that is possible right here. For example, here we show the time of the session, the average load, the cumulative load, the percentage of load that was added to the progression, pace, distance, average cadence, and your pain and comfort score. On the session graph, you can see on the horizontal axis the time of the running session, whether the vertical axis on the left shows you the load of that running session. On the right, it shows you, in this case, the altitude of the running session. By simply clicking on another metric such as speed, you can put here in green the other metric on the graph. It's also possible to fill in some injury information if needed, some additional notes, and we will provide running programs very soon. By clicking on this icon, you will be redirected to the OnTracx Lab environment. And in this environment, it's possible to perform three kinds of biomechanical screenings. There is a screening test, a load intervention, and a lactate or exercise test. In the screenings test, it's possible to benchmark the load of your athlete against scientifically validated reference values. In the load intervention screening, it's possible to analyze different interventions, such as changing cadence, surface types, footwear, and more, on the load that your athlete is experiencing. This way, you can see or you can investigate whether the intervention actually reduces the load during running, thereby having a lower risk for overuse injuries. In the latter, the lactate or the incremental test, it's possible to perform such a running test to determine the aerobic and anaerobic thresholds, along with detailed load and cadence analysis. If you want more information on how to use or how to perform the screening, the load intervention test, or the incremental test, you can check this information. The features that we offer you are, among others, data visualization, the creation of training zones, and an in-depth load analysis. The goal of the screening test is to investigate whether the athlete is running with a high, a medium, or a low load at different speeds. For example, we can let the athlete run at different speeds, in this case from 6 to 18 kilometers an hour, but you can of course change this if you want to. And we also note the load and the cadence that is related to that speed. If we click on process the data and we scroll down, the following figure will appear. In this figure, you can see on the horizontal axis speed in kilometer per hour, and on the vertical axis the load in g-forces. As you can see, a green, a white, and a red zone has been defined based on scientifically validated research. A green zone means that the load of the athlete is low compared to other runners running at the same speed. The white zone is a medium load zone, and the high load zone is the red zone. So in this case, you can see that by increasing speed for James Parker, the load increases slightly up until 13 kilometers an hour, and then it increases exponentially until he falls within a high load zone. We also define, if there is one, a load breakpoint, which is here at 14 kilometers an hour, which means that below 14 kilometers an hour, the load is increasing steadily, while above 14 kilometers an hour, as you can see over here, the load is increasing exponentially. This can be very helpful in, for example, defining the speed at which the athlete can run or interval training. We also give you an overview of how many times the athlete ran at a low load zone, an average load zone, or a high load zone. The goal of the load intervention test is to check the effect of interventions, such as changing cadence or changing vertical oscillation on load, because we know that interventions have a very individual effect on that load. By checking whether the load effectively reduces, it's possible to advise the right intervention to your athlete. First, we want to create a baseline measurement which will allow us to compare the intervention to. And here we also note the load and the cadence that is related to the speed. Here we advise you to let your athlete run at a speed that feels comfortable for that athlete. Next, we can perform several interventions here at the same speed, such as changing cadence, changing shoes, surface, or any other intervention that you like. We also give the intervention load and the cadence, which will allow you to create the following graph. In the graph on the left, you will always see your baseline load, and on the right of your baseline load, you will see the load of your interventions. In this case, cadence increase, running with a different shoe, running on a different surface, and any other intervention that you would like to perform. By clicking here on the relative change, you can easily see which intervention effectively reduces the load and therefore can be advised to the athlete to run with less risk for sustaining a running injury. Last, biomechanical screening allows you to perform a lactate or exercise test while taking also biomechanical load into account. So over here, you can see that there is an increase in the speed of the athlete, which you can choose yourself. And we note the load, the heart rate, the lactate, and the cadence that is related to every speed step. If we click on processing the data, the following graphs will appear. First, as also previously shown, we will show you the relationship between speed, average load, and cadence, and also indicate whether or not there is a certain load breakpoint. Scrolling down further, you will see that the aerobic threshold and the anaerobic threshold will be automatically calculated. On the graph over here, you can see the relationship between speed, lactate, and heart rate. If, however, you want to choose to change the aerobic threshold because you use another method, for example, you can always do so by clicking over here. Automatically, your training zones will be calculated, and you can also change them by sliding over here. If you want additional information, you can simply go to ontrax.com, click on our knowledge base, and go to the support page. If you click on I'm a professional, go to Getting Started, you can download our Pro manual or check video tutorials such as